So in the summer of 2018, I started this project called Joshuto. At the time, I was thinking of learning C++, but then I came across Rust and decided to learn that instead. So the goal of this project was mainly for me to learn Rust. But now, almost 4 years later, it's become a much bigger project with a lot of contributors. And I just wanted to share with you guys my experiences and what I learned from this. So first, let's talk about what my project is. I describe Joshuto as a Ranger-like terminal file manager written in Rust. Now, if you never used Ranger before, I highly recommend checking it out or checking out my project because they make using the terminal a lot more efficient. They make navigating your files and folders extremely fast and efficient. Their interface usually consists of 3 columns: the parent directory, the current directory, and a preview of the next directory or a preview of a file. The top shows you where you are, and the bottom shows you some more additional information about the folder you're in and the file you have selected. You can navigate around using arrow keys or using Vim keys. You can select files, cut them or copy them, and then paste them somewhere else. You can have tabs. You can create new directories. You can rename files. Pretty much everything you expect from a normal file manager. In addition, it also supports bulk file renaming. You can select multiple files and rename all of them at the same time. And as I said before, the goal of this project was mainly for me to learn Rust. But another goal of this project was for me to replace Ranger on my system. It was kind of like a challenge I made for myself to replace Ranger for all my use cases. So with that in mind, I got to work. One of the first problems I had to solve was to choose which libraries I would be using. With my past experiences using ncurses based terminal programs, I decided to go with the ncurses library for Rust. I also found a few other Rust native terminal libraries like Termbox, but I decided against it because I wanted to use something I was more familiar with. Unfortunately, this would be a mistake that I regret making later on, but we'll get to that later. I quickly created a UI to display the directory contents of the current and the parent directory. Then I added logic to do different things on different key presses. Then I added more customizations like being able to remap keys, being able to theme different files, specifying which programs to open for different files, and then pushing cut and copy jobs into different threads so they can run in the background. Under the hood, I use a hash map to keep track of all the directory information, so I would have a path mapped to the contents of that path. In the beginning, I was thinking of also using a tree-like structure because a file system acts like a tree, but I decided against it because Rust is really hard to use when you're trying to make linked data structures. And to this day, Joshuto still uses a hash map under the hood for all of its directory content information. I have a main event loop where all the events are processed. This includes user input events, background processes events, terminal size changes, and so on. Now, I made a Rust tutorial video in the past talking about enums, and on that video, somebody commented if I could show a practical use for these enums, and this would be a practical use for the enums. I would have a top-level enum called app events, and then in this app events, it would have different variants for user inputs, for background processes like a IO worker job, or an event saying the terminal window size has changed. And I could continue adding more events to this app event whenever I want to process more events. So I hope this answers your question on a practical use of enums. Now, as you know, nobody writes perfect code, so I had to do quite a few major refactors over the years because of design choices I made in the past that were not so good. So I'll be going over some of them here. So one of the biggest refactors I had was switching from ncurses to tui-rs. Now, ncurses is a very primitive library. It doesn't have a lot of high-level abstractions. So it's really hard to write reusable code. Maybe you want a widget over here, a widget over there, but you want to reuse the code for the same thing because I have basically the parent directory and the child directory are the same widget. So ncurses didn't really have an equivalent to this. I know they had their windows.h or their panels.h, but then I could never get them to work. On top of that, ncurses doesn't really compile well sometimes. Sometimes ncurses has wide character support, sometimes it doesn't. So a lot of users, when they're trying to install Joshuto, would run into these errors. For example, one of my friends who was using OpenSUSE at the time couldn't get Joshuto to compile because his ncurses version was a different version that didn't have wide characters or something, or had something else, and it wasn't compatible. whereas Joshuto worked fine on my computer. And it was also causing a lot of screen flickering when I'm using it on the TTY. And I think the reason for this was because I was refreshing the entire screen every single time, which is not very efficient. So those are the main reasons why I moved away from ncurses. This was a pretty tough decision for me, but I'm really glad I did it because I think it propelled Joshuto forward by a lot and really helped with the adoption rate. It made my development life a lot easier, but it was also kind of sad having to delete a lot of the code that I wrote previously. I started the migration February 8th of 2020, and I was done by February 16th of 2020. So it took about a week for me to switch over, but you can see I was putting it off for 2 years before I decided to switch. Another thing I had to refactor was fsextra. So fsextra is this library that I used to use for cutting and copying files around for Joshuto. It was a really nice library written in Rust that made everything really elegant. I didn't have to write code to recursively go into every directory and move all the files over or move all the folders over. This library did everything for me. I just had to give it the source and the destination, and it would just do everything. On top of that, I also provided a progress bar so I can figure out how much longer it would take and show it to the user. But in the end, I decided to write my own implementation because fsextra was not very efficient. So I read the code, and under the hood, they don't really do any optimizations. For example, if we're just cutting a file from one directory to another, we can technically just rename it instead of copying it over and then deleting the old one, which is what fsextra did. Now, there's some problems with this. If you're trying to cut something from one drive to another drive, say you have it on your computer and you want to move it to a USB. Now this wouldn't work. This you would require a copy and a delete. So then when I was writing the code, I had to make sure to account for this case. I would first try and renaming it. If it doesn't work, then I would try copying it and deleting the old one. And this made cut operations much faster. Instead of taking 5 minutes for 100 gigs move, it would take like less than a second. Another thing I had to refactor was the mimetype.toml file. This file tells Joshuto how to open files depending on their extension. So for image files, it would try to open it with whatever image viewer you have. For video files, it would try to open video files with whatever video player you have set. Now this file got really tedious to maintain. You would have to copy and paste the same entries over and over again for different file extensions when you probably just want to use the same image viewer or the same video player for all of them. So I decided to add an inherit attribute, kind of like object-oriented programming where you would have classes and you would inherit from a parent class. In the class section, you can write the different classes you have. And then in the extension section, you can say, okay, I'm going to inherit from this class. And then Joshuto will know to take all those entries from that class and copy it over to this extension. This way you can just modify it in one place and then it would change everywhere else. Now, as always, whenever you do a project, you always run into unexpected things. And I just want to go through some of them. They were pretty interesting and they just never really crossed my mind when I was building it until I had to actually implement it. So the first one being the built-in command line in Joshuto. I didn't realize I had to keep track of exactly where the cursor was inside the string and then have to figure out exactly where to place the cursor on the terminal to show the user. I had a lot of bugs where the cursor would be in one place, but I would be inserting characters in a different place, and that's a really bad user experience. So another thing was drawing the inner corners of the borders. So how Joshuto draws these borders is first by drawing a huge rectangle and then drawing 2 lines in the middle. Now if you do this, the 2 lines in the middle is not going to be connected with the big rectangle. And I didn't really know how to solve this problem, and it wasn't until somebody created a pull request to solve it that it finally got solved. The next thing was having to put flush events everywhere whenever I needed to get user input. The reason for this is because listening for user input is on a separate thread, so it would continue to listen to user input even when the user doesn't press anything. Now this is not a problem until you decide to open a program using a terminal application. Say you want to open a text file with Nano or Vim or Micro. Well, now Joshuto is going to be stealing user input from those programs, and those programs are not going to work properly. So this basically solves that by telling Joshuto to not listen to user input until I flush the events. So Joshuto would receive an event, and then I would flush it so that it would continue to listen to a new event. If I don't flush it, then it would be blocked, and the other terminal applications can continue to work correctly. So that's basically all the technical stuff that I learned, but I also learned a lot of non-technical stuff like interacting with different contributors. So by now I've reviewed about 50 pull requests for Joshuto, and it's taught me a lot. I try my best to be inclusive, like the Rust community, and provide good feedback on their code. After all, these are random people on the internet trying to help me with my project. Many of them don't have a lot of knowledge on the code base or on the Rust programming language. So whenever they make a pull request, I try my best to be helpful and point out parts that they can improve on, like not using unwrap everywhere or reusing some existing logic or doing things in a different approach. So far, it seems everything is going pretty well. I don't think anyone has had a bad experience with me. If you did though, let me know. I've also learned some insights on building long-lasting projects. From what I've seen, most students make side projects with the goal of padding their resume or learning a technology that they don't know. And I think that's perfectly fine. I do that myself sometimes, but most of these projects end up getting abandoned whenever you feel like you've learned the technology already or you've gained enough experience that your side projects don't really matter anymore. So in my opinion, if you want the project to continue for any extended amount of time, you need other kinds of motivation. My advice would be to work on something that you would use on a regular basis. That was the case for me. I used to use Ranger on a daily basis, and now I use Joshuto on a daily basis, multiple times a day. So I have a lot of motivation to continue working on it and improving it because it helps make my life easier. It also makes finding bugs a lot easier because I'm using it. I find bugs using it every single day, and I fix them when they become too bothersome to me. Though I think Joshuto is at the stage now where it's met most of my use cases, and any additional features would be from other users or just quality of life changes. But fortunately, there are other people using this, and they'll find some feature that they want to be included, and then they'll make a pull request or make an issue for it. So yeah, it's been a long journey getting here. I've learned a lot of Rust from this project, a lot, but I've also learned how to interact with people, how to review PRs, and how to make designs that are longer lasting. This project became a lot bigger than I initially anticipated. If I search now on Google, I would see a bunch of results on this. There's even a YouTube video going over my program now, which is very flattering. And I just want to thank everyone for this, all the contributors that contributed to this project. I couldn't have done it without you guys. And it means a lot to me that others are using my software and enjoying it so much that they're willing to improve on it. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the video. Feel free to share your side projects down in the comments below. I'll definitely check them out. Like, comment, subscribe, and you can even star my project on GitHub. And I'll see you guys in the next video.